Welcome to the PA-Centered Podcast. My name is Ben Williams.
And my name is Cody Henry.
We are both members of the PQR communications team, and we are your new hosts for this podcast. We are trying out a bit of a different format. Instead of one host with one guest, we'll be expanding the podcast episodes to include two hosts with multiple guests centered around one central topic. We'll also be talking about upcoming events and trainings offered by PCAR. While the host and the format of this podcast have slightly changed, the purpose of this podcast remains the same. In each episode, we will be talking about topics or current events related to ending sexual harassment, abuse, and assault. Our goal is to help our listeners spark conversations and to break down barriers to building communities free from sexual violence. As an important reminder, this podcast will often discuss topics that may be difficult for some listeners to hear. Please take care of yourselves. Cody, why don't you introduce what we're going to be talking about in this episode?
So this episode discusses the topics of human trafficking. Human trafficking is, of course, the use of force, fraud, and coercion to compel a person into commercial sex acts or labor against their will. In this episode, we'll be speaking with two experts who work in the anti-trafficking field. One is Corinne with the Polaris Project, and the other is Lily with the YWCA of Carlisle and Cumberland County. We will address some common questions about human trafficking, address some misconceptions, and talk about working with survivors who have been trafficked. Corinne, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Corinne Arkin. I am the Director of Survivor Care and Outreach at the Polaris Project. And I've been with Polaris for over 10 years. I actually started as a hotline advocate, taking hotline calls at the National Human Trafficking Hotline overnights and on the weekends, and then have had a wide variety of roles and mostly worked on the hotline. But the hotline was recently transitioned to another organization. And so now I am directing our Survivor Care and Outreach programs and kind of helping steward Polaris into a new era of survivor-centered programming and convening with the field.
Very nice. It sounds like quite the resume you have there. All right. So for people who may only know about trafficking from headlines or movies, how do you usually explain it?
I usually explain human trafficking by saying it is a form of modern day slavery. And so what that looks like, and sex trafficking and labor trafficking, while they sometimes happen concurrently, kind of have different components to them. So sex trafficking is when somebody over the age of 18 is compelled to engage in commercial sex. So sex for something of value, doesn't have to be money, could be, through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. If someone is under the age of 18 and they are engaging in commercial sex, they are a human trafficking victim. So no force, fraud, or coercion is necessary. And I'm talking about the federal definition of trafficking here. In terms of labor trafficking, similar, so compelled to work through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. And so I realize that kind of sounds like a complicated federal government definition. And so when explaining human trafficking to someone who's maybe not an attorney or not in the federal government, I think it's best to say it's basically when somebody is forced to do something, work or commercial sex, that they don't consent to doing. And there are a wide variety of ways that can look and can happen. And so it's a complicated crime.
Yeah, so who tends to be the most at risk, and what situations or life circumstances make someone more vulnerable?
Yeah, Polaris actually did a really incredible study several years ago called the National Survivor Study, or the National Survivor Survey. And we surveyed over 400 different survivors. And what we found overwhelmingly was that people who had experienced poverty were most at risk for human trafficking. And so what that means, what we can glean from that, and also from many, many other statistics that we came up with from the study and also from running the human trafficking hotline for 18 years, is that people who have other vulnerabilities that come from systemic oppression in our country or in other countries are most at risk for trafficking. So people who have economic disparity, people of color, LGBTQIA people, identifying people who are in the foster care system, and also an overwhelming number of women and girls who were sexually assaulted are at risk for trafficking become trafficking survivors. So anything that makes somebody kind of vulnerable to exploitation, to someone coming in, a trafficker coming in and saying, I can help you, I can get you a job, I can help you so you have a roof over your head, I can provide love, some vulnerability, some need that they have that isn't being filled, gives way to an exploiter or a trafficker being able to show up and promise that need and then take advantage.
Okay. And how does trafficking overlap with things people might not immediately connect it to, like domestic violence, homelessness, or social media? You touched on it a little bit in your answer, but could we dive into it a little bit more?
Sure, no problem. Something that I think is increasing quite a bit, just due to the changes in our society, is that young people are more and more being exploited online, and that there are exchanges of child sex abuse material online where no sex act is actually taking place between two people, but that child is a victim of sexual online exploitation. And the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children is actually a really incredible place that is handling that and helping with that, and something that's worth checking out if people want to know more about that. So social media is a place where, any place where people can interact with each other, exploitation can take place, those types of conversations can start, and then someone might be vulnerable to trafficking. Another thing that I think people don't often think about is labor trafficking. We very often in our communities and in our media and in our movies hear about and talk about sex trafficking, but labor trafficking is more prevalent as far as we know, and takes place in industries like construction, hospitality, restaurants, places where you have temporary workers, people who are here on very valid visas, may not know their rights in this country, or maybe were fraudulently recruited into a job. So, someone who has an au pair, for example, that au pair might actually be exploited. And so it's important to know where the vulnerabilities are, where the systems are in place that are not really protecting people. And that's where you can kind of understand then how someone might become exploited.
So, what are some red flags you wish more people knew how to recognize in their everyday lives?
So I think actually what we've discovered over years and years of kind of doing this work and talking to survivors is that it's nearly impossible to just spot someone being trafficked. You won't just see exploitation in its pure form such that you can then report it or help or do something. And it's actually kind of problematic to think about red flags, because you could end up flagging something, let's say for law enforcement, that's actually not human trafficking, and then you could cause harm to those people that are involved. So what's more important than thinking about red flags, I think, is thinking about some of what I was just saying. What makes people vulnerable? Where are the systems that are breaking down, or where there's their inherent racism or an inherent economic disparity? Where are things happening that make people hugely at risk? And so if you're a person who cares about this, you are upset that this is happening and you want to do something about it, then volunteer to be a mentor to a kid in foster care. That's how you can help. That's how you can say, this kid might not be trafficked yet. Maybe they are, but that's the red flag, right? That's the red flag of like, this person is at risk for trafficking. So instead of thinking about red flags for trafficking that's currently happening, think about red flags, that would make people vulnerable. I do think also there are some kind of observable conditions that we can notice, particularly for people who are in industries where trafficking takes place. So let's say you work in a restaurant and you are a server, but you've noticed that the guys washing the dishes in the back seem to be working 14-hour shifts with no breaks. That's concerning, right? That would be what I would call maybe a red flag. Let's say you work at a hotel and you notice that someone checks into that hotel, pays with cash for their room, and then over the next 48 hours, many different people are visiting that hotel to go to that same room. I'm not sure how you would know that. Maybe it's a motel and you can see the doors. There are things that are observable that are concerning. We shouldn't think of those as things that allow us to diagnose that trafficking is happening. We should think of those things as concerning conditions that mean we should create a safe response. So what is safe for that victim or survivor to do in that moment. And usually, if it's safe for you, if it's safe for the person, it's to offer safety, to offer help. And if that person's not ready for that help or not ready for that safety, that's okay. But offering help or safety or a safe way out is a good, safe response for that. I hope that answers your question.
Okay. When it comes to prevention, what actually works and what gives you hope right now?
So prevention is something that is widely talked about in the anti-trafficking field. And there's a lot of prevention could be many, many things. So like I mentioned before, poverty is a big indicator for trafficking. So helping prevent poverty or homelessness, those things are preventing trafficking. Educating people who work with kids about signs that they might be abused in the home, that could be preventing trafficking. So prevention spans all kinds of people and industries and spaces. And so again, I think if you're a person who cares about this, think about not necessarily people that you know, but the places that you frequent or places where you might encounter someone who might be more vulnerable to trafficking. So if you work in schools, if you work with kids in any capacity, if you have assistance for people who are unhoused or need food assistance near you, again, foster care, construction, hospitality, all of those industries, domestic work, think about like where you might intersect with those spaces and think about who might be vulnerable there. And if you can volunteer or if you can help, if you can just put up information about trafficking so that people know what it is and what they should do. I think what gives me hope right now is that the anti-trafficking space has gone through quite the journey, right? There were times many years ago where people didn't even really know what trafficking was. I have been in real situations where I've told people what I do for a living, and they've said, "Oh, like that movie Taken." Well, a little, maybe not so much. You know, like the complex nuances of trafficking are much more detailed than that. So, and I think we've actually, as a society, in America in particular, have come a long way in understanding that a little bit better. So with that, also, we've gone through a lot of ups and downs. Right now, there's a lot of divesting from anti-trafficking funding. There's many nonprofits that work on anti-trafficking and other nexus crimes, like you mentioned before, sexual assault or domestic violence, lost funding last year and had to close their doors. There aren't enough beds for trafficking survivors. There are 0 beds in this country for adult male trafficking survivors. 0. So what gives me hope is that despite those things, despite the challenges, despite the barriers, we're still here. We're still doing the work. Survivors are showing up, doing work. People are thinking about what can help. How can we make survivors thrive? What makes people more vulnerable? People aren't giving up. They're still working on this issue. You're having this podcast. You know, you care enough to talk about this and to tell people about it. So that's what gives me hope, is that things are hard and we're still doing the hard thing, the hard work.
Yeah. So the Polaris Project, do you have any resources that are available to the public that the public can like access so they can learn more information about human trafficking?
Yeah, we have a lot of great resources on our website. One that I'll point out is we actually have a human trafficking 101 training. It's quick, it's easy, it's great, and you can take it and understand more about what human trafficking is and what it looks like and how it occurs. So and it's free. I would highly recommend that to anyone. Like I said, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children also has a lot of great resources. Yeah, I would recommend going on our website and kind of checking out some of the previous reports that we've put out. We've published a lot of great reports. You can find the National Survivor Survey that I mentioned earlier and learn a lot there. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. And is there anything that we haven't touched on that you would like to kind of get out there into the public at all?
I think it would be great for people to look into what they have in Pennsylvania. Or in whatever state they're in, what are the resources for for trafficking victims, for where are the rape crisis centers, where are the domestic violence shelters? Look those places up. Donate to them if you can, donate your time if you can, and just know that they exist, because you might be in a situation where you encounter someone who needs help, and it will be great if you could just have that resource in your back pocket, be able to share it.
That's a fantastic ending point right there. Fantastic.
Yeah. I would just thank you, Corinne, for your time. And if there are some organizations that you think we should be sharing, we'll include it in our show notes.
That sounds
That,
great. Thank you so much for having
yeah,
me. I really appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you for coming on and giving your expertise.
Yeah, thank you.
our second guest on this episode is Lily from the YWCA in Carlisle. Welcome to the PA Centered Podcast, Lily.
Thank you for having me. My name is Lily Duarte Evans. I'm the Vice President here at the YWCA Carlisle Cumberland County. In this role, I oversee sexual assault and anti-human trafficking services for both Cumberland and Adams County. And so we provide support for survivors, drug services, their loved ones who are affected. We operate 2 hotlines between the 2 counties, and we do in-person accompaniments to those hospital forensic rape exams. Between the 2 counties, we have 5 hospitals total, and then any law enforcement agency, things like that. So we're providing support in the very immediate aftermath, but then those who are affected maybe years prior and still want to engage with an advocate.
Awesome. Well, thank you for coming on this episode. So you're often the first call when someone makes it in the middle of a crisis. What does that moment look like, and what's the most important for you to do right then?
Yeah, so that moment can look very different for whoever the survivor may be, and depending on where we're responding to. Typically, when we're getting called out to the hospital, we're meeting with a survivor, and it's a really close to after the victimization, right? Because they're probably considering a forensic rape exam, and we're, taken to the hospital to just get checked out. So we're really meeting them in a space where they are still going through the worst possible thing that's happening to them. And so there, we want to make sure that they understand that they aren't alone, and that they have the choices and options available to them, so they don't feel like they're making a decision, that they have to make just because they're there. Because it's hard to kind of go through all the things that you're going through and then still have to have that clear head to say, okay, how do I, make sure that everything is collected so that we can go through an investigation if that's what I, want to do, right? It's just a lot to think about in the forefront. So for us, just making sure we're there, being able to reassure them that they have time to make the choices that they want, and just, knowing all the options that are available instead of just like one path that might be, only visible at that time. The other side of that is when we're meeting with survivors who are recovered through law enforcement. Our county does a lot of like human trafficking operations where they're either attacking the demand side or they're attacking the business side, and they're recovering women in those spaces. And so we've also responded to just random traffic stops where a traffic stop was made, a trooper or an officer were able to assess the situation correctly and able to see that there was someone that needed help. And so there, our priority is just building rapport, right? And just sharing with them that we're available, that we're not tied to law enforcement or an investigation by any means necessary, but we are there to provide support and options and choices if they'd like. Many times when I've met with a survivor in that sphere, it really is, I'm just sharing my name and I'm just sharing a hotline and just saying, hey, call me back, right? 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 2 days after today, just call me back, right? And so that does just go a long way to just, let them know that they're not cornered or have to participate with something if they're not ready to.
What are some of the preconceived notions you and your team face on the front lines that people outside this work might not realize?
So I think for us, we see a lot that folks have the idea of a victim of trafficking or a survivor of trafficking in their head. And when you're met with a person or a survivor that doesn't fit that, it's hard to kind of wrap your head around, right? And so for us, we see survivors through all walks of life. We've provided support to kids as young as 2, right? And adults as old as like late 60s, early 70s. And so for us, just being able to kind of just engage everyone to just know that it's more than just, young women or, those runaway teens, though they're a big population of what we're probably working with, but it's just not the full scope. And it also, when you're wanting to like engage the community, right, and rally them up, knowing that they're also looking out for their most vulnerable populations and not just, again, just one subset, because that's what's happening, right? We're working with the survivors where we're, meeting them in all the spaces when they are identified, but then that bigger part of the majority that aren't identified, they're getting, they're becoming vulnerable to traffickers because they're just left out in the community, not really being watched after or sought after, and those vulnerabilities just makes them more favorable to folks that want to take advantage of them.
So you talked about a lot of with like how you collaborate with local law enforcement, healthcare, and courts and everything. What are some ways that you increase the visibility of human trafficking survivors?
Yeah. So I really do believe, and especially for our county, like that collaboration piece is so important. And so just building those relationships ahead of time, right? Ahead of meeting the survivor goes a long way. When we began services in Cumberland County for human trafficking, it was, I think, like summer of 2022. It wasn't that we had a survivor and we said, okay, we're beginning services. It's no, we're beginning services. Let's bring folks to the table to even paint the picture of what this would look like. And so that's when our CEO, Maddie Young, and myself and our director of support services got together and really formulated our human trafficking coalition and invited so many folks to the table, right? People that you might not even believe or thought that they should be at the table, because it is community response and a community impact, right? When we have those survivors landing within our communities, if they're not already here. So it had to be that in order to establish support, in order to call ourselves any type of expert in this space, we had to have those relationships first. For when a survivor does come, right? Because they're not typically finding us first. Typically, they're engaging with the systems first, or typically they're engaging with other human service providers first, and then they get connected to us. So we just had to make sure that anyone who engages the survivor at any level had the same response as if it were us.
And then you touched on this just a little bit, but I'm curious. So going back to collaboration, what is the big picture of collaboration and establishing the relationships with fellow agencies and government organizations to help survivors survive during the beginning stage of assistance?
Yeah, I think that big picture definitely has to be defined by that group, right? To see, well, what is our goal? I think overarching, the goal is going to be the better outcome for that survivor so that they have things in place, options in place, resources in place, so that if they don't want to, engage in something like that, they don't have to, right? Many times we're also facing that too, especially in this day and age. Unfortunately, there's a lot of limited options available, and so we don't want to assume that everyone is just a victim of something, but you do want to make sure that if choices are available, they are able to take it, right? And so for us, being able to say, okay, so what's the big picture is that everyone can live freely, everyone can live safely, right? And are able to make all the choices that they want to make. Then okay, then if that's our end goal, then let's work backwards to that, right? And so see what those steps are for that. And a lot of times it's just that it's making sure that we have adequate resources, accessible resources, making sure that we have community partners that are informed and like well assessed or well equipped to provide comprehensive support for folks that might look different for other folks when they're going through other things. So just making sure that everyone is kind of on the same page with the same goal, but that we're all attacking it in a way that makes sense for the role that we're in.
So in this work, you see both harm and resilience up close. What keeps you going on the hardest days?
That is a great question. So I think it's everything and nothing all at once, a little bit, but I think it's an understanding that we probably won't get that success that we're looking for today, right? But we can do things today to get us to our success at some point, right? And so kind of really making sure that we're like making some of those things digestible and like reality, right? Things that can stay within our control, making sure that we can align with that. Also working with the survivors, right? Even if it's a survivor that maybe is a little more challenging, or maybe you guys don't mesh well, but you're still being there, available, and making sure that you're still just showing up for them, that's a success, right? And that keeps you going. And then relying on the folks that you're working with. Many times, many times after a day of working with a survivor, engaging with survivor, and we're working with our partners, also taking that time to debrief and kind of just have those conversations that are not so just client focused, but also just professional focus, right? You really want to take the time to kind of, because you really can't take this home with you and share this stuff at home. So you really want to make sure that you can build a connection with the people that you're working with, not only just in your agency, but also outside of your agencies too. I know on our end, our leadership team are currently working through something called CSERT, which is like trying to figure out how to kind of address vicarious trauma in the workplace, but not just kind of self-caring ourselves to death, but really focusing on the situation, kind of like low pack debriefing, and then really kind of attacking it in that moment so that you're not taking it forward with you for the rest of the day or the rest of the week. So things like that, making sure that you're like going out there and educating yourself on how to get better, so that it's always a conscious choice and top of mind, and not something that you have to do once something bad happens.
Okay. And then looking towards the future, if you could change one thing right now, policy, resource, or public awareness to better protect survivors, what would it be and why?
Such a great question. I feel like we could do something for everything, right? So there is a lot of policy right now that really does exclude a lot of our survivors. And so we're looking in spheres of like housing and, services available, and for agencies, making sure that they have enough funding available to provide the support that's mandated and needed, right? And so there's many different pockets of advocacy and change that can happen within that sphere. I think resources too, I kind of touched on it a little bit, but we're always focusing on, how do we support the survivor? How do we, become available and be available for them? But also, how do we combat trafficking to begin with, right? And how do we make sure that people aren't falling vulnerable to traffickers? Because they're very, they're smart, they're sophisticated. They have a really real business model, right? And what it is they're finding folks who are vulnerable, who don't have readily available things, who have unmet needs that they're plugging in themselves. So they're making that survivor dependent on them, right? I think we're so used to someone, or like in the news or in TV, we're used to that snatch and grab and that forceful model of trafficking. That's not what we're seeing at all. We're seeing someone who approaches someone first as like a romantic partner, or someone who's coming into someone's life as an authority or caregiver figure, and they're filling in those buckets, right, of support and need. And that's how they're getting these folks to do the most horrible things ever. And they're not leaving, they're staying, they're choosing to stay, right? Why would I go out and try and get something differently if I know this is how I can get it this way, right? The unknown is scary for folks. And so just having resources available where it's not hard to navigate, where it's really easy and accessible, and having service providers that are able to kind of point that out and see that out in the real time, like that would go such a long way in prevention for survivors. And then that public awareness piece, I think, just not being afraid to have a conversation. I think we get lost in the teaching, right, of just saying, okay, well, we want to educate you on a topic, but you got to engage folks. It has to make sense to them so that you can really have them understand what this complex victimization is, to then have it be that they're literally attacking this every single day. As an agency, we do have like that human trafficking 101 training, but we also have something like a 102 that we do specific to case managers, to all human service providers, because everyone has a survivor in the caseload. I don't want to hear anything about, oh no, we just focus on this and we just focus on this. No, you have a survivor or a victim on your caseload right now of trafficking. This is how you build that rapport with them. This is how you can assess that. And these are the things that you really want to focus on, so that you can have them just feel like they're in a space where they can share with you what's going on. Many times, like, I think someone can know, someone can tell when, you really don't care, when you're just asking those surface level questions. But if you're asking that second, third question, I feel like you do get more information of just like what's going on, that bigger picture of what's happening. And then you as a provider, you're able to kind of see, oh, this is more than what I thought, or, oh, this is actually not okay, what's happening. Let's try and plug in some more things there. So a lot of things that very one impactful question, but I do think there's many different opportunities for us to change and make things better.
Well, Lily, thank you for your time today. Is there anything else that you want to touch base on this topic before we go on to the rest of the show?
Yeah, I think for everyone to know that there is always, right, an agency, someone, hopefully groups of people working in this line of work, and to know where to get resources. Again, I mentioned we provide support in Cumberland and Adams County in Pennsylvania, but throughout the United States, right, there's agencies, local rape crisis centers or local human trafficking, anti-human trafficking services that are available for support. And being able to just know how to find those things through Google really does go a long way for survivors. Again, you don't want to find someone and say, you're a victim, and so here are the things you need. That's not what we're saying. It's just knowing the information ahead of time so that when a loved one, someone that you're working with, or someone does disclose to you, or you're seeing some signs and they come to you and say, hey, I need help, you already know kind of where to navigate them to.
Well, this was very enlightening. Thank you so much, Lily.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And that brings us to the end of our episode. Thanks again to Corinne and Lily for offering their time and expertise.
And thank you for listening to this episode of the PA Centered Podcast. Remember, if you are a survivor of sexual violence and need help, we can help you find resources. If you are in Pennsylvania, you can go to our website, pcar.org, to find what center serves your county. If you are outside of Pennsylvania, please visit our partner Reliance's website to find your closest center at reliance.org. You are not alone.
You can also follow us on social media. You can find us by searching for PCAR on Facebook and Instagram. Be on the lookout for more episodes soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye for now.
If you or a loved one needs help, a local sexual assault center is available 24/7. Call 1-888-772-7227 for more information, or find your local center online at pcar.org. Together, we can end sexual violence. Any views or opinions expressed on PA Centered by staff or their guests are solely their own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of PCAR or PCAR's funders.